Hello and welcome. So today we're going to be looking at maximum prices. So maximum prices are a different type of government intervention. So maximum prices are a form of government intervention which caps prices in the market. So essentially a firm can't charge any higher than the maximum price. Now, this is put into place for many reasons, but mainly it's put into place to protect the consumer. So when we're thinking about a maximum price and we're thinking about why the government intervenes into a market. So remember, it's always so important for us to remember, why is the government intervening into the market? Why are they putting in a maximum price? Why are they doing that? Who are they trying to help? And what do they want the outcome to be? Well, most of the time that they want the outcome to be to protect the consumer, that means that they have to set the maximum price in a very specific way. So what I'd like you to do is just to pause the video and to think about exactly where they're going to set the maximum price on this diagram. So obviously the maximum price is there in place to protect the consumer. So if you're going to protect the consumer, that's going to indicate to you that prices are too high. Well, if prices are too high, we're assuming here just normal market mechanisms, so therefore we are operating at the market price. That's the price equilibrium and the quantity equilibrium. If that price equilibrium is too high, even for under normal market mechanisms, then we have to make sure that our maximum price is below that market equilibrium price. So we have to make sure that the maximum price in the market is set below our price equilibrium here. So they may decide to set the maximum price right there. So obviously the implementation of a maximum price happens for many reasons and it has many effects in the market. So the first thing that you should automatically see without a shadow of a doubt is clearly here we've had an extension in demand. Now this is purely theoretically, this is just on paper we've had an extension in demand, and we can see that that's gone from QE to QD. And we can also see that because the price has fallen in the market, that we have a reduction in our supply. So less suppliers or suppliers that are already in the market may be willing to supply less at that price level. So we can see here that we have a fall in our quantity supplied. And actually what's happened in the market is we have the creation of excess demand. And when we have excess demand, normally our price will increase to eradicate the excess demand. That's normal market mechanisms. But because that can't happen, it means that we have a lot more consumers in the market than producers. Now this is all completely theoretically. Bearing that in mind, I just want you to think about what kind of goods or services might be subject to a maximum price and why. So maybe just pause the video and have a go writing some of those down. So here are some examples of maximum prices that you may have thought of or you may know about. So remember first and foremost that we know that whenever the government intervenes in the market, they're not just going to intervene using one type of government intervention and then kind of let the market go, apart from with pollution permits. But normally they're going to intervene with many different types of market kind of intervention. So it might be that they have a maximum price, but it also might mean that they have a guaranteed demand. So those suppliers in the market have to meet the demand in the market to a reasonable level. Some of the things that you should have, or maybe you did come up with, are water, gas, electric. You need to think about why these kind of things are going to be subject to a maximum price. And one of the main reasons they're going to be subject to a maximum price is because they're essential. Everybody has to have them, and actually because of that, that means that the demand is very inelastic. Well, if demand is very inelastic, and then you also need to think about what type of market structures do these fall under. Now, it may well be that they're an oligopoly or a natural monopoly or a monopoly. Well, now we need to start thinking about the market conditions that means there are for consumers and also producers. So first of all, for these types of goods or services, we know that there is an incredibly inelastic demand, as I said earlier. What does that mean? Well, that just means that there is a less than proportional change in the quantity demanded following a price. Well, then you need to think about what do firms need to do to increase their revenue when they're facing an inelastic demand. Well, if they're facing an inelastic demand, to increase their revenue, they're going to increase their prices. So can they increase the prices should be our next question. Well, if we think about the market structure, if it's an oligopoly, if it's a monopoly, if it's a natural monopoly, then definitely they're going to have a huge amount of price setting power. So one of the issues that might happen in the market is that you have a very inelastic demand, and you also have a situation where if firms want to increase their revenue, then they need to make sure that they're increasing their prices. And you also have firms that have a lot of price setting power. Now that's definitely a recipe for complete and abuse of that power and consumers being worse off in the market. So the government might intervene to ensure that they are tackling inequality, or they're making sure that that power is not being abused and consumers are actually benefiting and making sure that they're getting access to the goods and services that they need to be able to be, productive or just lead a basic kind of standard of living. So all of these may be subject to a maximum price. So one of the arguments that we talked about before is that there's going to be creation of excess demand. Now, obviously when you're asked about this in your exam, if you're looking at a 12 mark or 15 or a 25 mark question about government intervention, and you want to have a look at maximum prices, and especially you're looking at these kinds of industries, definitely one of the things that you're going to be referencing, or the examiner is going to expect you to reference, is maximum prices. Now, one of the arguments that you might put forward is just what we spoke about before, that there's going to be an excess demand in the market. However, how can we counterbalance that? Well, what we need to think about is making sure that we're taking our theory and we're applying it to the markets that we are talking about. One of the markets that we were talking about is a natural monopoly. Now, we know that with a natural monopoly, there is one provider in the market, and there are some very kind of specific and special aspects of a natural monopoly that means that actually that excess demand might not exist in the market, and we might not lead to kind of the things that happen when you have excess demand in the market, maybe a black market, some of the stuff we're going to look at, in a couple of minutes' time. So we are arguing that if you have one, that we've got a very inelastic demand and an inelastic supply in these industries. So we know that we've got an inelastic supply, that we've got an inelastic demand, and therefore that changes some of the characteristics in the market. So we have a very high, under normal kind of market mechanisms, we may have a very high price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. So one of the things that the government is going to have to do, or potentially may do, is introduce a maximum price in one of these industries. And at the moment we're just going to talk about the water industry. So they're going to set their maximum price. And we know that that's below the market equilibrium. Now, one of the most important things that really sets a natural monopoly aside is to do with its long run average cost. Well, we know that the long run average costs are going to be falling over time. So they're continuously falling. It's what makes a natural monopoly quite special. So here I have our AR and our MR, and I've got the short run marginal cost here, just through kind of reference for a moment to be able to see a few things on this diagram. But I'm just going to put in the long run average cost. Now, as I said before, this needs to be continuously falling over time. So it's just going to look like this, and this is our long run average cost. Just pause for a minute and think about what might be different if I was doing the short run average cost rather than the long run average cost here. It's pretty simple. If I was doing the short run average cost, then this would have to increase after our short run marginal cost, because if our short run marginal costs are higher than your short run average cost, then obviously your average cost is going to be increasing. That's why I've just made a differentiation here between the short run and the long run. So therefore, that means that actually we're not under perfect competition. When we're in a world of perfect competition, we know that the market price, in the long run, if you charge less than the market price, then the firms are going to make a loss, they're going to exit the market, etc, etc. But those rules don't necessarily hold when you have a downward sloping AR and MR curve. If you have a downward sloping AR and MR curve, there is some price setting power, and many firms can actually make a small amount of supernormal profit if they are offered below the market price. And that is definitely true when we look at a natural monopoly. We can see that actually all the way up to the sales maximising position, when the AC is equal to the AR, that they are making some supernormal profit, and then at that point obviously they're only making normal profit. So when we introduce the maximum price, we might be suggesting that actually we have this amount of excess demand. But you can make an argument that actually under the natural monopoly, that's not necessarily true, because natural monopolies can kind of provide to the market a much higher quantity than at the market equilibrium. And actually they can provide at this quantity here and at this price, which, because it's a natural monopoly, we can actually take this all the way across, and we can see that that's even below the market price here. If you're confused about what I just did there, you can have a look at my theoretical monopoly video and it'll explain that one for you. Now, actually, in reality, the government will allow the natural monopoly to make some small amount of supernormal profit. There's two reasons for that, two main reasons for that anyway. The first main reason for that is because obviously most natural monopolies nowadays are private firms, and therefore they have to make a small amount of dividends to their shareholders, otherwise the shareholders will exit the market. So they need to be able to allow them to make some supernormal profit, just a small amount to be able to do that. And then the second reason is obviously they want to allow the firm to invest in dynamic efficiency so that over time they can lower their own average cost and offer cheaper prices. And they keep renewing, and they can keep renewing and revisiting that maximum price, and hopefully can bring it down for consumers over time. So this is kind of an argument that you can talk about in your exam as to why actually this idea of excess demand might not kind of fall through, and it might not be an issue in kind of one of these, potentially these in the oligopoly as well. The other one that you might have come up with is rent, and I just want us to kind of have a look at rent. There's lots of calls at the moment for maximum prices of rent in the London kind of renting market. We know that prices of rent have massively exploded, and also the amount of consumers renting has also increased. In London in the 1990, I think it was like 11% of all properties in London were rented, and now we're near somewhere like 30% of all properties in London have are rented out. So the renting market is getting much larger, prices are increasing, and there's lots of like kind of problems that have come up with that. So there is some really interesting articles on The Guardian run in March and April to do with the kind of re-election of the London mayor. So you might want to have a look at that if that's useful for you. So maximum prices in rent. So rent is kind of a completely different market, and I want you to think about why the rules that we previously spoke about before with the natural monopoly might not hold for rent. Well, one of the things is, the most important difference between those two markets is the market structure. So the market structure for rent is completely different. Think about what you think the market structure for rent is. Well, the market structure for rent is a monopolistic market structure. It's definitely not a natural monopoly. Obviously that's different, like you might have localised monopolies, you might have localised kind of oligopolies, but overall it's a very monopolistic market structure. You can argue about barriers to entry and exit, and it's a much bigger conversation that we're not going to go into for this video, but I'm just going to say for now that it is a monopolistic market structure. So we know that here we're going to have our maximum price, and we're going to say that our maximum price is set here. So what is the difference between a natural monopoly and a monopolistic market structure? Well, our main difference is going to be around the elasticity of our AR and MR curve. We know that consumers will switch if there is cheaper properties around, then they will switch. It definitely falls under monopolistic. So we're going to have quite an elastic AR and MR curve. Our MC curve is going to look exactly the same, and our AC curve is here. So we're going to assume that obviously firms are profit maximising. Obviously that's so different in a monopolistic market structure, whether they're able to or they know to, especially with small businesses. They're actually quite able to know exactly where their AR, their MR is compared to their MC. So we're going to assume that firms, kind of landlords, so to speak, to be specific, are going to be profit maximising. And we can see here, this is the price that they're going to charge their tenant, and this is the amount of supernormal profit that they are making. Now, obviously, because the AR and the MR is so much more elastic, one of the things we know is that they're definitely going to be making a lot less supernormal profit. They have less price setting power. The more elastic your AR and MR is, the less price setting power you have. So one, they're going to have less price setting power, and they're going to make a smaller amount of supernormal profit. They're not having the cost saving measures of a natural monopoly. The LRAC is going to follow the kind of normal long run average cost where it falls. So you've got economies of scale and then diseconomies of scale. However, so we may be in a situation where this maximum price here is actually set at this point here. So this might be the maximum price for this landlord here. So we can see here that if this is the maximum price that they are able to charge their tenant in their property, that actually at this quantity here, this is the price, then the landlord is actually making an area of loss. Well, if they're making an area of loss, what does that mean? Well, let's think about what the options the landlord has. Well, they have an option to be able to switch and sell the property. If they're not going to make any money from renting their property out, then one of the things that they're going to do with the asset is to try and claim that asset back. And therefore they might sell the property from then on in. If they sell the property, that means that they'll leave the market, and we can see that that is exactly what we said might be a potential problem here. We've had a reduction in our quantity supplied. So all I've done here is just prove that potentially if you set the maximum price too low, then we are going to have a fall in our quantity supplied, because some landlords or some producers are not able to produce at that maximum price. They're going to make a loss, and therefore they're going to exit the market. Equally, we are going to have an increase in quantity demanded for properties. Obviously, if you have a lot of people who are renting one property and suddenly the price falls and they don't have to share anymore, then obviously they're going to have an extension in demand. It's not like with water. If the price of water falls, it is obviously inelastic. So actually we don't kind of go, oh, the price of water's fallen, run all the baths in the household. We kind of keep our usage quite stable, whereas with housing it's far more elastic, and consumers will enter the market if there is a fall in price. So essentially what we have here is we have an issue. That issue can be really serious in this market. We have excess demand in this market, far more so than we do in kind of the water, gas, electricity markets, and that becomes a very large problem, because you can enter into black markets, poor living conditions, landlords having a lot more power and being able to abuse because they're breaking the rules, and you have like over tenants and over your maximum amount of tenants, etc, etc. It's a huge problem if there's a black market in the renting industry. So basically what we're trying to say here, to kind of sum up, is that every single government intervention that we look at can work in some markets, but it might not potentially work in others. It all completely depends on the industry and the market conditions. Maximum prices can work really well if you're looking at an oligopoly, natural monopoly, even a theoretical monopoly. And it can be really effective for consumers, and also an incentive for producers to lower their costs and be below that maximum price so that they can make even more profit. So it can be an incentive for producers and also work in favour for consumers. But if the market structure is slightly different, or if the market conditions are different, then a maximum price may not be the best option compared to other options like the creation of an ombudsman, or kind of rent percentage cap, so mortgage plus 5%, etc, etc. So there might be other options that are better. So all government intervention has to depend on the market and the market conditions that the government is trying to implement it on. I hope this video has been useful for you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Happy learning. Bye.